You're listening to a Floating Voter Brexit special in association with EY. Hello, I'm Kevin Doyle, and this is the Floating Voter Brexit special in association with EY. It's been a week when Boris caved on a border in the Irish Sea, Leo caved on a time limit for the backstop, and Arlene, as ever, said no. The Brexit clock is still ticking, but no doubt somewhere in Westminster today, Theresa May must be rolling on the floor laughing. I'm joined, as always, by I&M's Deputy Political Editor Philip Ryan, partner in EY's Transaction Advisory Team Simon McAllister, and former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. You're all very welcome to the podcast. Bertie Ahern, we've watched, I suppose, this morning, history being made, a border down the Irish Sea, Boris Johnson doing something that his predecessor said no Prime Minister in Britain could ever do. Has this been, as he would call it, statescraft? But there's been a lot of caving, hasn't there? Both sides have really caved.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge, there's been a huge amount of switching in 1 week. If you take where we were this time last week, we were talking about what new scenario might come up. We had meaningful vote 3 rejected, the 3 votes gone, and then we're on to what was the concept of a 4th vote, where Northern Ireland would leave the customs union the same as the UK, but stay aligned to the EU customs system. And then that wasn't satisfactory, so then there were changes around along the way. Boris, I think, has probably made about 3 big concessions. I mean, he's won the line down the Irish Sea, which was anathema when Theresa May was there. I mean, that was mentioned. It was mentioned by the Taoiseach at one stage, and if you recall, almost everyone went ballistic at that stage, and he had to go and say no, that was a half a joke. But the 2017 agreement, where the DUP, in fairness to DUP, I think they've been consistent. They went bonkers in December 2017, and now they're being forced fairly closely back to that position. And they might even feel pushed back beyond that position. So I think it's a very interesting position. The only thing really that's the good thing is no infrastructure border in the island of Ireland. That's hugely important.
We've got what we wanted out of this. If that was the principle all along, that there'd be no infrastructure. So has Leo Varadkar won? Has he played a masterful diplomatic game?
He's played a good game. He's played a good game. I mean, the only thing for us is on the argument that the backstop, the time limited. And if you follow that, it's 4 years. But I think the DUP were correct in arguing that northern politicians should have some say in massive issues that affect them. I think that was a fair argument by them. The only thing that wasn't fair was that it could be by the petition a concern vote, not the consent
DUP
vote.
veto.
Yeah, the DUP
But we were always
veto.
told that a time-limited backstop is not a backstop, and I'd be very interested to see the final legal text. I don't think it's been published just yet, if the word backstop is even mentioned in the political agreement.
I doubt it will be. I think what'll be very interesting, it'll be looking at Theresa May's 2017 legal text and putting it side by side with what comes out today.
She must be laughing.
And I don't think you'll have many redacts to put in on the two. That's what I'd like to see, though, in the Ireland protocol, and take the two, and because
Do you feel sorry for her?
I do. I mean, because maybe she hadn't. I think the difference is that it is going to end up very close, but she didn't have those skills of going out and being able to sell it. Now, but Boris has a bit of selling to do. I presume he won't give up the DUP. He'll keep at that. The Labour 32, how many of them? I mean, a lot of them have puffed and huffed about voting for a Brexit deal if it was right and if it was agreed by the European Union. How many of those 32? Or does he allow in an amendment, which he'd hate to do? But I don't think Boris would care, to be honest. But a lot of his people would hate to do, is to say we can have a referendum
on this deal.
On the deal. Now, that would be the last thing on the list. I assume the huge effort they will do is to try and square off the DUP between now and 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. And I think I'd be amazed if they don't do that. And secondly, work on.
If they don't try that, or if they don't
over.
agree to it, if the DUP will the DUP come on side?
I think they have to try. If the DUP this morning was saying, as of now, now he's gone ahead with the agreement because he had to. Like he could not have a situation where 27 heads of state were coming, and there was no statement by Juncker and Barnier. So he didn't have much road to move on that. The European Council, if the European Council had started with no legal text, I think it would have turned into a shambles very quickly. On that issue, they had lots of other business to talk about, Syria mainly. But he had to make a call by 12 o'clock, and he did that.
Simon, there must be a lot of businesses very relieved looking at this, albeit it still has to be passed, because we weren't really ready, were we, for a hard Brexit?
I'd probably split the readiness between the private sector and the public sector, and I think the public sector have done an awful lot over the last 6 months. They had done an awful lot of work in the run-up to the original deadline in March. Over the summer, from what we've seen, they have continued to work on particularly the most vulnerable areas. The budget, obviously, just announced, reflected that. It focused on the key risk areas, particularly around agri. In the private sector, there is continuing to be a very low level of readiness for no deal, especially. And, depending on the survey you see, and we would do our own ones, it's somewhere between probably 50 and 60% of businesses would have little to no preparation, and worse for SMEs in particular. From
what we know of the detail that's out there around customs, around VAT and regulatory alignment, is this a good deal then that business won't have to be hugely impacted, that life just goes on?
I don't think life will just go on. Well, I suppose the first thing probably to remind ourselves is, and we talked about the language, it is still a backstop that we're talking about, whatever the language is, and I agree, they probably won't use that language because it's so toxic. It is the arrangement that goes into place if we can't get a deal, and a deal being a free trade agreement. So businesses, today and over the next 24 and 48 hours are kind of exactly where they were last week, that they still don't know exactly what it'll be. They don't know for sure what sort of forms they'll need to do. They don't know exactly the customs arrangements. They still are trying to deal with a lot of uncertainty. And that's the difficulty most firms have had with trying to do the preparation, that they're not quite sure, some of them, where to start because they're not sure exactly what they're trying to plan for.
I think it's an interesting point from what Barnier, and he just slipped it in. In the agreement that's now written, it's December 2020 with an extension of a year or two. Barnier, for the first time, slipped that into his press conference, saying a year or two. Already, and you know probably more about this than I do, Simon, but the 5 big trade groups in the UK last week that represent way by the majority of British business have started their campaign on the next phase of realignment with the EU. And that fight, and particularly in the Tory party, and if the Tory party win the next election, which I suspect they will, bar some kind of a miracle, for the Labour Party and the others, I think they'll be in the strong position. Big business will be knocking on the door on MPs. And I think as time goes on, in spite of all their stuff about getting out of Europe, when big business comes knocking and jobs in Sunderland and Newcastle and everywhere else, you will see more alignment, and that will help Irish business. I mean, the more we will do all our huff and puffing too, but the reality is it'll be the 5 big trade groups in Britain that will influence the alignment of the trade deal, which will probably take 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I think it's a good point in terms of that shift, because, again, going back to the preparation thing, you can contrast what's happening in Ireland with what's happening in the UK. The public sector in the UK, particularly over the summer and since Johnson took over, has been exclusively focused on no-deal preparation. And their preparation previously had been, relatively limited. It has been very, very real and very substantial over the last 3 or 4 months, and they are much better prepared for no deal than they were previously. But now I think the question will be, how much does the government infrastructure sort of turn towards the future relationship? And similarly, as Bertie said, for business, how much do they start to think about what they're going to be looking at afterwards?
I think 5 or 6 years would be very ambitious to finish off the future trade agreement as well. International standards.
Putting on international standards, but to be honest, the next trade deal, or the trade deal, the UK trade deal, will be on the other side of a Trump presidency, even if he gets a second term, God forbid, and on the next side of the next British general election. So, I talk about Theresa May kicking the can down the road. The can they'll have to build a lot of new roads before it'll get to the end.
And presumably the next general election in the UK is going to be pretty soon. It'll be, if this deal is struck,
inevitably.
It's no point in Boris Johnson hanging around anymore.
And you see Johnson winning that hands down?
Well, he will, even if it's at best for the others, is that it would be a hung parliament of some kind, at best. But a 15% lead now, taken the last 10 polls over 15 months of the main polls, now not taking the main polls, it's 8%. On a first past the post, where it's straight vote, very hard not to see them get a majority.
But I think if Brexit is boxed off, if there is some sort of deal reached, and who knows what will happen on Saturday, but if it is passed, the election might shift away from being about Brexit and being about the other issues, possibly from his own point of view, going down the road of the NHS and going down the road of crime and all these issues. And then from the opposition, I'd say this issue with the American lady and being brought on trade missions, things like that, that'll become a huge focus of the election campaign. So who knows what will happen then?
Yeah, but I assume Labour desperately, in spite of what they've been saying, calling for election for the last few years, but they desperately don't want an election pre-Christmas. Boris, if he gets this through, he's in a stronger position to dictate the election pre-Christmas. So I think the battle, if Saturday works, doesn't work, on goes the saga, but if it works, the battle next week will become whether they can get an election.
Let's bring it back home, Philip, because we're going to have the parallel conversation about, is it a Brexit election? When will it happen, pre or post Christmas? And will it be about health and housing or about Brexit? How do you think Leo Varadkar will try and spin the deal that's there now and I suppose to claim victory, while Fianna Fáil simultaneously say you couldn't have done it without us?
But it was extraordinary. Now, I know we hadn't seen the full detail of the deals this morning, but Bertie Ahern, Fianna Fáil's public expenditure spokesman, was straight on Morning Ireland, simply supporting whatever shape is happening with this Brexit scenario, even though the backstop seems to be dead in the water, despite all promises. So Fianna Fáil are continuing with their support. Anyone that you speak to around Leo Varadkar, especially those who are involved in his election campaign to become Fine Gael leader, they're all pushing for an election as soon as
you wrote about Michael Noonan today, speculating
even Michael Noonan
that
is pushing for it.
He's pushing for it, even though he's not going to be running. But he, of course, famously wanted that November election when Enda Kenny didn't
as did Leo Varadkar,
2015.
And that's still in the mind. So look, I've always thought that the election would be next year, but there's a huge swell of support for having an election this year, basically because they don't want to buy elections. They don't want the worst impacts of whatever Brexit emerges to bed in, because Brexit will seem grand for the first 3 weeks or a month of this, but then people will start to realise, well, no matter what happens with Brexit, there's going to be problems for the country and for trade and for businesses all over the place, no matter what happens, how great this deal is. So they want to get out there, look like they've just run over the finish line with Brexit on their shoulders, and they'll go to the public.
Bertie Ahern, our colleague John Downing was writing during the week in the Indo about the particular knack you had for calling snap elections, albeit at the end of the 5-year term, so it was coming one way or the other. But your early morning jaunts to the Oris and the like. Do you think Leo Varadkar should go for it in November?
No, I don't, because he's kind of nailed himself on a number of fronts. I mean, he's gone for the summer election. He wanted the extra year of the competency supply. The budget process for 2020 does not end until the legislation from that.
That can be done very quickly, though, if they want.
I don't think it will.
Are you speaking with your Fianna Fáil hat on?
No, I don't. Well, there was a time I used to devise the tactics for Fianna Fáil, but I don't do that anymore. But if they do, I think Fianna Fáil will have a MasterCard in accusing him having taken 4 years of competency supply that kept him. That government and the Kenny's government and Leo's government in place, and then on the first time they got a good day of hit to the wind.
Now, Fine Gael, I think, would argue that Leo Varadkar offered May 2020 to Micheál Martin, and Micheál has refused to say one way or the other.
The big fear is Fianna Fáil are going to pull it in February.
Micheál has always said Brexit, once Brexit's done, so you could argue that Brexit is done come Saturday if it happens.
Well, if Fianna Fáil went for a February election, they definitely have lost their marbles, in my view. It will always be a bigger advantage going for brighter days and better days. I mean,
you always went for the summer elections.
Yeah. Because the reality is that campaign-wise, Fianna Fáil have probably 10 to 1 more members and activists, even if they're not paid up members on the ground. So
even now,
in a summer election, as against a media election where you have 10 people on either side stuck in studios.
Myself and Philip never get a day off. And
driving the public mad. So, but I'd say predictably you could organise your holidays anytime after 31st of May.
Great. Simon, do you think the country needs an election at this stage? Because we have, from a policy point of view, a media point of view, politics, everything has just been focused on Brexit, and it's almost like a thunderstorm. You need something to just break that.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think what most businesses want at this stage is clarity, and they would also like stability. And an election is unlikely actually to probably bring the stability piece, because you're going to get change, and changes will be across the board, and you'll have if you have a new government with new priorities. I think it really comes down to if Brexit gets done or not, and what do we mean by done. And if we do get a deal on Saturday, and then it moves to what the future relationship looks like, will this government's priorities for that be the same as whatever the shape of the next government would be? What do they do with all of the other competing priorities in the economy around housing in particular, and the sort of big capital investment plans they have? And would a new government have a different view on that?
Do you think Micheál Martin will be Taoiseach after that election, Bertie?
Based on the last poll, it's too tight to call. But
go on. You used like an odd bet.
The Irish Times poll now, or
no. If the Irish Times poll, but I mean the Irish Times poll was done in the 48 hours after the best news that Fine Gael got in 5 years. So I don't put that down as a very representative poll.
After a rubbish budget, though, as well.
Yeah. Well, with a non-entity of a budget, but there's a different context of budget now. Like the whole budget was a Brexit budget, and a huge amount of resources, including a lot of borrowed money, was in that. So I assume the first thing you need to do is take out the borrowed money, because that's not a good idea for business or for anybody or for stability. But there's still a lot of money that you can switch around. So I'm sure Pascal will
he's always said he wouldn't
stay on for 3 or 4 months spending that money that he won't need for Brexit.
As in a supplementary budget, have another one, or an emergency.
Well,
they
just reallocate it. They say they don't need it for Brexit, so they'll have to do.
He's always said he wouldn't do that, but you think the temptation will be too much?
Of course it would. I mean, because the budget last week was lost. I mean, I'm not even sure it was on your headline the following day. It was one of those. I used to get a week out of budgets 25 years ago.
I always say the test of a budget is it still on the front page of the Sunday Independent the following week, and that means you're probably in trouble. But do you think he should, Simon, go back and do another budget, or find a way to figure out what commitments can be reneged on from last? Well, it's only a week ago, wasn't it? It was last week.
Yeah, it was a week ago.
God, a lot has happened. Should he go back? Obviously, the money won't be borrowed, but there is room then, there is fiscal space, in inverted commas, to spend elsewhere. Those tax cuts we wanted, perhaps.
Well, I think it depends on who you ask as to how much fiscal space is there. I mean, ultimately, he is, as Bertie said, he's going to borrow probably 75% of those Brexit contingency plans. We don't have enough of the space there from current spending, because current spending in the rest of all the government departments has been increased. Health continues to increase. So like our debt position is still very, very significant at an absolute level. It's unchanged from 3-4 years ago. So people talk about debt to GDP, very favourably having come down, but that's because of a GDP number that's gone up very significantly rather than debt that's changed. So I'm not sure people would be. Well, again, it depends on your perspective. Would people be racing for him to go back and unpick it and start to spend money in other areas? If they want the current government to get re-elected, they would probably advocate for it. If they want some sort of relatively more prudent approach, they would probably argue to leave it as is.
Let's talk a little bit, Philip, about Sinn Féin in all of this, because Gerry Adams yesterday was very provocatively tweeting at the DUP, which seemed like the exact wrong moment to be trying to go back into the trenches and kind of to the I suppose the sectarian view of all of this. Sinn Féin haven't had a great Brexit, have they?
Well, I think the context for Gerry Adams, he was over in the US. He was playing on the old sectarian values. It was a completely wrong time to start jumping down that route. Everyone knew it was a knife edge. He knew what, like a simple tweet from Gerry Adams has as much impact as anybody during these
It's probably
negotiations.
more impactful than Mary Lou MacDonald.
Well, possibly. She's been relatively quiet, and we haven't heard from them this morning yet as well. So you'd wonder if they are ready to back this deal, or if this is something, because we have to remember as well, this isn't only going to the House of Commons. The Doyle will also have a vote at this on some stage as well to give its seal of approval. Now, it doesn't look like they need Sinn Féin as such, but as far as the optics go, it'll be fascinating to see which way they'll vote.
Bertie, what did you make of the role Sinn Féin have played in this? They came out almost day one looking for a border poll on the back of it. A cynic could suggest they'd nearly wanted a hard border or a hard Brexit because that would have fed that narrative and perhaps accelerated it. They have an economic island now on the back of this deal, but it probably puts that unity question down the road a little bit.
Yeah, well, the simple answer to that, and I think it's on the border poll they were wrong to throw that into it at the time that they did. And I think they pulled back a fair bit from that. But that's the first point. But what their policy from day one was that they wanted Northern Ireland, a special position for Northern Ireland. They've got that. So if logic dictates anything, they have to come out and welcome this deal, because it's illogical. Not that Northern Ireland have now the best of both worlds. They can trade on the island of Ireland with no frictionless border, and they have the benefits of the single market and the customs union for most things in Northern Ireland, with exemptions built into this when we see the small print. But if the reports are there are exemption for certain things, and agriculture that comes from UK to Northern Ireland.
Do you not think they'll argue that there is now an exit from it, and there is, albeit complicated, but a way that a hard border can return through these vetoes that Stormont has?
It's going to be a majority vote, So I think they would be, I think, very mealy-mouthed to say that this is not a good deal. Now, they might be for opposition stake, and the fact they're watching elections down here, whether it's now or.
But there is a route now.
Months.
If Stormont does vote, if there is, we don't know what the next election or whenever it'll be up there is, and if the union side come together and decide they don't like whatever is on the table.
Well, that won't happen because the UUP even wouldn't agree with that, an alliance, and to be honest.
And this is the DUP's problem, isn't it? Yeah. They know they no longer have an outright majority.
Yeah, and the DUP were probably split both ways for the last few weeks. They had their agricultural rural communities and a lot of their small
which
SMEs.
Fosters from.
Yeah, a lot of their MSEs desperately saying the idea of switching goods or cattle farming from Fermanagh, down to County Louth, that they're going to pay tariffs on. I mean, that would have been a disaster for the DUP. And on the other side, they had some of their stronger members in East Belfast and some of the loyalist groups saying that anything that moves this a step further, a potential United Ireland can't be dealt with. So, I think they were in a difficult position. But Peter Robinson, if you go back to that speech that he made in the McGill School last year, he was arguing that if Northern Ireland economically wanted to play this right, they should be looking for a way that they could trade fairly frictionlessly with the UK, and they could also keep the island economy, and they've got that. So I mean, Peter Robinson is still a very significant person within the DUP.
Simon, there is an argument now, in theory, as Bertie says, they have the best of both worlds in some ways. Is Belfast and Derry now a much more attractive place to invest if you're one of the many multinationals, I suppose, that come to Dublin? You can get your access to the UK and the EU if you go there now, maybe rather than Dublin.
Again, as Bertie said, the devil will be in the detail, and it has that potential. I think if you're a services business where a lot of the tariff issues fall away, and rules of origin complexities are that the Northern Irish market will be attractive to people. They have great availability of talent. They have a very much lower cost base than we do here. So I think that would be a plus. However, there's still a concern, I think, for stability, that until all of this is resolved and all of it is put to bed with all of the details, why would you risk putting something there in terms of a big investment if the rug could be pulled out because of a change in the political situation or whatever it might be? I think the other issue is that, and then going to the sort of the goods and manufactured part of the economy, they will have frictionless trade north-south, but they won't have fully frictionless trade going east-west. And there will be a burden there. There will be paperwork that people will have to do. That will be relatively onerous depending on the kind of business.
What odds, Bertie, now? Does this make the getting the Stormont Assembly back up and running any easier, or does it matter?
It does matter. I mean, ultimately, and for just the reason that Simon said, I mean, if you're a business person or you want to do internationally investor, and you get your report from your experts, Northern Ireland would show up as a great place to do business, except the political stability. And political stability, if you're an investor and you don't follow politics too much and you just want to hear, and somebody said, well, there's a slight problem that they have a local elected assembly, and they haven't met for 3 years, and they have a local government, i.e. executive, and they haven't met for 3 years, and they don't really deal the way they're meant to with the government in the south, and they don't like the government in the UK either. If you're an investor, you'll probably head home.
You were talking just previously about your own budgets there over the years. Is there any measures, and you say they were in the papers, is there any measures that over that long period, 14 years you were in there, that measures that you did put forward that you kind of regret given the current state of, say, the housing crisis or things like that which could have, in hindsight, which is a great thing, that may not have been great to announce on budget day?
Different times and different issues. I could rejig that for you, but I need a longer period to do it. The one thing is that the one mistake that was made after my time was we shouldn't have stopped building houses. We shouldn't have listened to all these people talking about all of these derelict sites, and we'd be waiting for 2050 before we fill all the housing things. We shouldn't have.
So what about people that argue that there wasn't the money there to do it?
Yeah,
there's going to be a narrative in the budget.
What happened is people stopped spending it.
In the election, I should say, there's going to be a narrative which is that Fianna Fáil are going to say that Fine Gael have failed over the last 7-8 years to get on top of the housing. There isn't enough being built. Young people are rental prices, putting them out of the market. And Fine Gael and Leo Varadkar, we've already seen them do this, and the Dáil are going to argue, but you caused all this, and this was Bertie Ahern and Brian Cowan housing policy that made the mess.
Yeah, but you know,
who's going to win that argument?
I think, you know, as in other countries, you see the Greeks, the people who were there at that time, and the Spanish things. You know, times move on. And if a political party fighting elections should always be fighting on the future, if you start fighting it on the past, you know, you're back in, you know, did we make mistakes in 1921 on one side or the other? You know, it's a useless thing. If any political party trying to win the hearts and the minds of people in the next election need to be putting forward what they're going to do for the next 5 years, next 10 years in this country. It's a young population, intelligent population, and what they want to make sure is we don't follow mistakes of the past, and neither do they want to talk about the successes of the past. I mean, they want to know what's going to happen in the here and now and into the future. So anyone that's trying to play the game of the old thing will be wasting their time. In my
But just as far as policy formation, it's probably a good idea to kind of understand the mistakes that were made and kind of
and the successes and the successes, Philip, and the successes.
But you can see the successes, I suppose. It's hard to see the mistakes. Like people see the
they see
the infrastructure,
I mean,
they see the roads.
If you're paying high rent, you're paying very high rent, you realise the reason for that is that you know we didn't continue to build enough houses. People also a few years ago said we were building too many houses. The problem was we went from 80 to 8. Maybe some of the houses were in the wrong places, and maybe some of the tax incentives were misguided. And I've said that several times that they were, but what we need to be doing now is dealing with the crisis as is. We've a growing population. The population of this country is going to continue to grow fairly massively. We've growth rates of probably 5% still. We'll see what happens next year. I mean, we're cutting it back from 5 to 3/4, which sound a bit extreme to me. But let's say we continue to grow 5%. we've huge challenges. We're still getting enormous big investment into the country. Massive technological companies, pharmaceuticals are still coming in. Hopefully, will come in. So we need to be basing our policies for now 2020 to 2030, and that's what the agenda for the next election should be. Not what happened in the past. Where we are in 2030, how we position ourselves, with the UK out of the European Union. The issues in Northern Ireland, somewhere in the next decade you'll probably see a border poll. Scotland.
The next decade?
Probably in the next decade. It's hard to say.
Some people would say that's very soon. That'll terrify the DUP on a day like this.
Well, it won't, because it'll only happen. You probably would have had a border poll now if you had have had a stable executive and assembly working. You're not going to get any border poll as long as you've no executive working. If you had about 5 to 10 years consistency, and if you don't have it working for 5 to 10 years, it's no point in having a border poll. I don't think you can't argue that you're able to run your affairs, and this is what's wrong with the Sinn Féin argument.
Would it pass if we had it that soon?
Well, it won't be soon. It'll then be 30 years, over 30 years since the Good Friday Agreement. What was envisaged is that it probably would arise in the first 10. The only reason it didn't arise in the first 10 was because the executive was stop-start. So it would be hard to believe that you don't get that a vote, say in what, it's only 8 years' time. It'll be 30 years since the Good Friday Agreement.
So your intention was that
Northern Ireland could be the Singapore of Europe at that stage. They want nothing to do with us, and even the republics. And
I think Northern Ireland handles this right. They will do very, very well, but they have to get political stability, and you're not going to get your border poll until you have political stability for a sustained period.
That suits the DUP then, doesn't it? That suits the DUP then, the staying out of power sharing.
Well, I think in fairness to the DUP, I mean, the DUP have consistently said
no.
But they've consistently said they want to see the Assembly and the Executive up and running. And in fairness to Arlene Foster, and I've spoken to her about this at times, I think she genuinely wants to see that working. And I think any politician in Northern Ireland must want to see an Executive and Assembly working.
Last word on this, I'll just go around the table. Philip, Europe stuck by us despite all our doubts?
They did, but we've kind of compromised as was expected. I know it was kind of working in the media and spending the last year asking the government, will they change on the backstop and would they accept a time limited? And then then they have to go with the mantra, I know, for the negotiations. But at the end of the day, I suppose the obvious has happened and we have had to cave, and as has the English side or the British side to get a deal.
Bertie Ahern, they'll come. I was in Brussels recently and I asked a question of a fairly senior official. There'll be payback for this, won't they, from the EU? And the answer I got was, we won't link this to corporation tax or anything like that, but it'd be nice if you showed some solidarity in the future.
Yeah, but I think on two issues. I think the first one, there's been compromises, but Boris has made 3-1. I think that's the first thing. Corporation tax issue, we can take it. Corporation tax, I remember fighting with Leon Jasper the first year I was Taoiseach, 22 years ago, whenever it was, about corporation tax and the harmonisation of corporation tax. It has never gone away, and it's not going to go away. And as you know, they're trying to work now on the OECD rules to try and get so that issue is going to come back one way or the other.
Simon, they're coming for us.
Well, it would be a worry. I mean, corporation tax is now a much more important part of the Exchequer position than it would have been 5 or 6 years ago. I think, and some of that corporation tax is quite mobile. It's driven by things like intellectual property, which can be relatively quickly, let's say within sort of 6 to 12 months, moved to other jurisdictions, and the corporation tax will follow. So, it would be concerning for business if tax rules were to change, either in two ways. One, with very little notice and very, very little clarity around what future arrangements would be, or that the sort of net position would be worse either for businesses or for the country as a whole.
Great. Well, the great conundrum. Last question, Bertie Ahern. Are you going to watch the rugby or the House of Commons on Saturday morning?
I'm going to watch the first half of the rugby.
and give up on it then.
And then I'm going to check the results.
All right. Well, we will see how it develops as we get towards Saturday and into next week. But that is our lot for now. My thanks to Philip Ryan, to EY's Simon McAllister, and former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with more from the Floating Voter. You're listening to a Floating Voter Brexit special in association with EY.